All right, today I want to talk about why players overrate the opening. And the story I had told for years about this was that people were overrating the opening because of the feeling of power that one gets when one holds the truth, as it were, in one's hands against an opponent. And that certainly is still true in my mind. But I recently deeply studied this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and I came to understand that there are psychological reasons for us to overvalue the opening. And I want to get into them, not only because I think it'll help us play better, approach the game in a more constructive way, but also just because it's kind of intellectually interesting. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just talk about trauma over the board for a second. And for example, I have played against the King's Indian for decades now, and I think statistically, I'm doing fine against the King's Indian. However, there have been a couple times when I was mated, okay? And it looked like this. So like when my mind is asked, like, what happens in those positions when I was mated? Well, it was like this, I'm up 1,000 pieces, but I'm getting mated. And that trauma really sticks with a player. And because of that trauma, you can end up doing irrational things. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about in this little video has to do with trauma and opening preparation. So one thing I want to say first about trauma is that we give an outsized importance to pain, especially if pain is experienced at the very end of an experience. So, for example, I've lost loads of games. Not all of them ended in mate, but this one kind of does, right? Not kind of, it's ending in mate. And if you do experiments with pain, let's say a colonoscopy, and you could choose your method of pain, and imagine it's 30 minutes long and you end with a peak pain. Then you do one with 90 minutes, but the last 30 minutes, not so bad. People will remember the 30 minutes of pain when it ended with pure pain as far more unpleasant than the one with 90, even though the one with 90 had 30 minutes of the exact same pain as the 30 minutes one, right? So similarly, in a chess game with something like the King's Indian, I'm going to remember the time I was mated in the King's Indian, and I'm not going to remember thousands of other games where there were backs and forths and all kinds of other stuff. I'm just not going to remember it because I'm going to remember the pain. So that's important when thinking also about what I'm going to say with opening preparation. Okay, now what I can say is I've searched my mind, and although I think you can say that in every game you can talk about someone winning the battle of the opening, just like who comes out and has a feel for the position a little bit more than the opponent, right? Most of those experiences, especially when I analyze them afterwards, the difference, the meaningfulness of that advantage is not too great. But then I ask myself, okay, well, how many times, Kraai, in your thousands of games that you've played, have you won a game because of preparation? That, you had this power in your hand and boom, you delivered it. I think one time that I can remember, over decades of playing. Then I ask myself, and I remember that game very well. Oh, the feeling of power. That was 2009, end of 2009, tournament that David Bruce of the Dojo organized. And then how many times have I lost because of preparation? I remember that game very vividly too. 2003, I was knocked out, French defense. And beautiful preparation by my opponent. So those two memories, oh my gosh, the trauma is real. The trauma is very real. And so one of the things that we do when we have those kinds of traumatic events is we give them an outsized proportion due to the pain that they caused us, because that feeling is like a loss of control. And it's the end experience, because at the end you're like, oh, I didn't even have any control over this game if I lost it. And then if you won, it's like, oh man, that felt powerful. Right? So here, let me give you an example. I like this. I think this sentence pertains to the chess world. So for example, here we go. People are almost completely insensitive to variations of risk among small probabilities, right? A cancer risk of 1 in 1,000 is not easily distinguished from a risk of 1 in 100,000, although the former would translate to 3,000 cancers for the population in the United States and the latter to 30, right? So same thing with openings, right? We have these memories of a painful experience, and then boom, it just turns into this catastrophic thing. And then let me show you an image here. Two images. If you have a 1% chance, this is just studies they've done with people, to win $100, people are only willing to sell that for 5.5. So obviously, if you were going to trade it as a rational person, you would trade it for $1, right? That's what it would be worth if you were traded on the market. But people have the hope. Oh, they have the hope of winning that $100, and they're going to sell it for 5.5. Same thing, 5% chance to win 100. Oh, they're going to sell it for 13.2. Totally irrational. Similarly, if you have the risk of losing something, right? Let's say a 1% risk of losing 100, you are going to pay more than that 1%. You're going to pay something like 5.5 to get rid of the pain, right? So in this chart, you see it's just expressing that people are, about being risk averse and risk seeking in these various types of situations. And that definitely applies to openings. And so it creates this situation where people get addicted to the feeling of power and the hope, the hope of easily crushing their opponent, and invest huge amounts of time and resources, outsize amount of time and resources, same amount like you're paying more than the gain that you're going to receive. You're investing all this resource to get that one experience because you remember it. And the same thing with the fear, that goes with being prepped against, right? That you want to have it all figured out. Quick funny story to end this video. I was doing some Chessable prep online, and I was playing a tournament. Turns out it was one of Kostya's students, right? And this guy knew, before he got paired with me, and then in the moments before, he looked me up and saw what I had prepped against the Grunfeld. And there he comes to the board, and he's blitzing it out, and I already feel kind of funny and weird, right? And one of the weird things about that game is I was doing fine out of the opening. And at some point, I was definitely winning. But the memory of being prepped against had an outsized impact on my understanding of the game, right? It was like, oh man, this guy really got me. In fact, he didn't get me at all. But that memory of he used something against me that I didn't have control over. It created this whole thing in my mind. And then Kostya ratted him out and told him what he did. And it was like, oh man, this guy's evil. So that kind of thing goes on in the psychology of players. And it really, does all kinds of tricks that prevents us from studying the things that we should. And I think I'm going to use this as a place to try to sell you on the idea that going over your games will actually reconstruct the narratives. For example, in that game, I could have, if Kostya had told me that and I hadn't studied it, I might have the narrative to this day that he got me with prep. No, it wasn't true at all, right? When you look at how the games actually go, you'll see it's very rare for it to be a totally punishing effect. Now, you could say, what about the elite level? Is that different from the chump GM level that you're at, Kraai? Maybe, but I can guarantee it's the same thing that I'm describing here. That might happen more, but the value that they attach to the openings is nevertheless higher. I want to be clear. So it might happen more that they beat somebody with prep, but this same psychological effect will apply to them. Okay, there it is. Why openings are overvalued.